want to do is I want to start off with a very simple question, and that is to think in terms of one particular moment and to think about a particular question. And that is to ask the question of when was the last time you heard the voice of one of your loved ones? It can be a child, it can be your partner, it can be somebody else that you're deeply connected to in some form. And I would assume the answer is largely, especially since all of us own cell phones these days, that it was within the last week, the last few days, depending on who you're talking about. Something that we hear their voices, either on a personal level or through some phone or something similar. Now, the reason why I want to sort of think about that for a second is that in many ways, this particular presentation is focused back on a particular evening years and years ago, back in 2008, when I first was about to start working in Ireland. And I was up late at night on Ancestry.com, and I was sitting there trying to understand a particular island where I was going to be working. And my daughter, our daughter, was asleep in a room next to us. And I was there on the computer after basically my wife and my daughter had gone to sleep. And I went and I looked at a record for the SSI Verna from 1909. And this was the record. And I've typed it out, but basically this is the digested information associated. This is one of those transcontinental records for passage for an individual, in this particular case, coming from Ireland across. And the SSI Verna was the boat that this individual was on. So her name is Bridget Malia. She's O'Malley. And this will become important because as I'm going to be making this presentation, her name appears at least with 4 different spellings. I'm going to refer to as Malia because in the initial records, she shows up, and her baptismal records shows up as Amalia. So Bridget Malia, born 1898 in Inishark in County Galway. That's about 5.5, 6 miles out into the Atlantic Ocean. With her, she's traveling with no money. There's no notes on her height, her hair color. The ticket for her is paid by her uncle Patrick Malley, and she's going to live in 53 Charles Street, Malden, Massachusetts, in the United States. So at the age of 11, Bridget Malia goes and travels from Inishark, having never left this island other than to one other neighboring island, and she travels to Boston, Massachusetts. And I think there's no question that when she went down to the water, right here in front of the village, that was the last time she heard the voices of her parents. That was that last step. And for me, it was absolutely chilling because here is this 11-year-old girl about to go on this journey into an area that she had no idea about. And to step off that kind of bridge with the lack of connections must have been beyond frightening. It must have been horrific. And in my case, I did find it frightening. It was something that haunted me, and it has stayed haunting for me. And so much to my surprise, for the last 16 years, off and on, I have tried to learn about this faceless 11-year-old girl who was born 126 years ago now, and to try and understand some of her world. And that's where I want to go. This is not Bridget, by the way. There are no photographs of Bridget. We have some photos of some of her relations at other points, but there are no photographs of Bridget at this point. And that's where I want to go, is I want to think in terms of how can one try and think about people in the past in a really detailed way, and in a way that allows us in some ways to connect to some of the work of James Baldwin in his particular very famous sentence, people are trapped in history and history is trapped in them. How can we use this as a way, in terms of Bridget's life, to understand immigration as a process, understand the kind of challenges that she must have faced, the kind of issues of dislocation, segmentation, and separation, and how can we sort of integrate some of the archaeological data sets with oral history and historical accounts to, in some ways, address the face and to think in terms of the person. And so this combination of objects and memory and history, and how can we do that to think about, in a more general way, Irish American immigration, but just as transferably in terms of Italian, Polish, Ukrainian, whatever we want to talk about, it's all the same. It's still one of the process of immigration is ultimately this act, the most altruistic act on the basis of the parents who come across, who sacrifice for the next generation, give up, certainly back 100 years ago, give up part of who they are so the next generation benefits. And that's where I want to go. So I want to think about several different questions. This is the island of Inishark that you see here. In fact, I'll just go back for a second so you can see. Oh, come on, baby. Oh, I won't do that. All right. So the mainland you can see in the background, this is what Inishark looks like at this point. It's an island that was abandoned in 24 hours in 1960. Nobody lives there anymore. It's there are sheep that are run there. The next island over is about a mile away of open water. And there's some relations and some people that go back and forth, but there still is very much this this sense of this abandoned place and this sort of materials preserved on the ground. So I want to think in terms of a couple of different questions and to sort of pull some of this apart. One of them is recognizing that immigration is it's a national narrative, but it's also one that we need to think in terms of what's the local and household impact of it. We talk about it in terms of the Phoenix arising, in terms of Irish labor helping to build America as a country. But it's also a two-way street. There are both people that come and some people that stay. And how does that change things in terms of sort of Irish villages and life in those different places? The other part to it is that the drivers of Irish immigration were multiple, and some of them are related to some family history, and a lot of them have deep personal stories, deep family biographies. And again, this is transferable to people who've come to this world from other places. So this is a story ultimately about 19th century Ireland and the spread of the Malia family into America. And in many ways, in terms of the kind of resilience, the human resilience that exists in our relations and the sort of these people in the past. So let me give you a little more context for this. So this is a project I've been doing for a number of years now and working in the far west. So this is Dublin right here, coming across to Galway, going out to here. These two islands right here, Inishbofin and Inishark, the farthest one out there, that's about as far as you can really go, certainly in terms of the northern half of the country until you get down to Kerry. So very small context in Western areas, very low population levels even today. It's one that I'll dive into in just a second. And using this as a case study, given that this is an abandoned island, this is from an archaeological standpoint, in some ways is a remarkable opportunity. One of the aspects to this, the silver lining, if you wish, is that everybody walked away in 24 hours. There was never anything mechanized there. There's never any roads. There was never any, there's only 2 toilets and they were up at the school. So you don't have the kind of destructive mechanized processes that you do everywhere else in Ireland. So if things were not dug by hand or built by hand, they weren't done. And so when people left in 1960, it's a frozen landscape. Nothing else has really changed other than there's now grass over top. Some of the roofs are gone. Some of the walls have fallen down, but it is still largely this frozen landscape. And as probably you all know, that makes a huge, huge difference in terms of preservation. Allows us as scholars to go in and look at something that we're much more likely to be able to interpret and understand correctly, given it hasn't been disturbed. So those are the big pieces to it. As a place where there's never any electricity, there was never any phones, there was never any gas, there was never anything that would sort of change things from where they stood back at this point of time. The height of the population, 1840s, 1830s, there was at least 300 people living on this island. By 1960, there was only 25 living on it, and they all left at that point of time. There's been some people who have camped there, myself and a lot of my students at different points. I've taken over there as many as crews of 25 students, 25 people, professional crew and archaeologists. And we've gone out there for about 3 weeks at a time. We have to stay in tents because there's no roofed housing, there's no Hiltons or anything else in some form. And we work it in such a way where we basically go out for about 8 days at a time. Then we go 2 days to another island where we can get showers and we can have drinks. And then we come back to our tents. So it's, we smell like sheep and peat fire by the end of this. We're very fragrant. So there's, yeah, it's one of those wonderful things that you know you have a sense of power and authority when you can go to the neighboring island of Inishbofin. On the island of Inishbofin, there's 160 people that live there, maybe 180, depending on particular day. They get a lot of tourists that come in there, but there's 4 bars there. So we have a certain authority and power, not only because we know people there and work with people there, but it's amazing when you get 20 archaeologists that have been in tents with in their own body fluids and outside with peat fires, not having washed. And when you walk into a pub at 6 o'clock in the afternoon, the first time back after 8 days, it's amazing how quickly people clear out of your way so that you can get to the counter. So we work, as you should understand, we work in concert with archaeologists, with lots of families in these places. And I'll acknowledge those in just at the end of the talk here. So first of all, shark on the left, right here. This is a map, by the way, from 1838. Sorry, 1816. This is the island of Inishbofin. This is the island of Inishark. It is literally the next step is Nova Scotia. If you wanted to set sail, that's the next spot for land if you run west. This is a place that has extraordinary fishing. The fishing is so good that it shows up in records associated 15th, 16th century French and Basque, Spanish whaling and fishing. They would go out there because the areas there are that good. And it's partially related to the Gulf Stream, but also the cold waters. So very good fishing. This is an island. Both of these were islands that were owned by one landlord at different points of time, sold off in different ways. But this is a place where everybody rented from the landlord. And there's quite a few people that were there. Both islands combined had about 1,400 people at one point. Now there's 160. So it's a very different setting from what you see today and into the past. This is what it looks like. Hopefully. This is what it looks like. We'll give you a sense. You can see the village sort of spread out with garden plots around the village areas, the houses. These were rented. We have good records of who rented them and who lived them at the different points, partially because of census information, but also there's a lot of oral history and baptismal records. And so we've been able to try and connect this together so we can have some good understanding. A couple other pieces to it. There's a church right here. These are all individual houses going back. These field systems are all made by humans since probably 1800, maybe 1780s. In some places, they have made soil that's as much as 2 meters deep by just hauling up sand, shell, adding kelp. So this is a landscape that's really, this village was created over a 250-year period of time. Quite something. Okay, so what I'm going to do is sort of give you a little bit more sense in terms of the archaeology, but then in many ways trying to weave together something that connects together both the physical archaeology that we've been working on, but also that of the historic records and the oral history, and thinking about Bridget, and thinking about how I can explain to you what I know about her at this point and how this fits together. One of the things that we've done that has really helped us enormously is back in 2011, we went and had LiDAR done of the entire village. In a great way, just due to circumstance, they did extra overflights because they is a commercial firm out of Coleraine in Northern Ireland. And I commissioned them to basically fly the village, but because of overflights and other complications, they ended up flying half of the island. And through negotiations, they just turned the whole data set over to us, which is brilliant. So what that allows is it allows us to understand that the village sits in the middle of a series of field systems. You can see the village down here. You can see rectilinear fields coming off, and then older ones that date back to the medieval period, to basically from the 5th to the 12th century for the most part. So there's an element of continuity to this, and an element under which we understand the village as basically as a physical unit because of tracking what's taken place with the village as a whole. Let me give you a little bit more sense of sort of aspects of population and some of the drivers of why people have come and left at different points of time. The blue line you see here is sort of a charting of population through time. This is based on good data, census information. It probably is underrepresenting what took place at different points of time. The bottom line is if you're dealing with economic engines of islands in places out in the West, in Western Ireland, then what you should understand is that war is good for business. War is good for an economy if it's fishing-based economy. And that's what took place. One of the biggest drivers of this was that of the Napoleonic Wars. In the Napoleonic Wars, they had to feed armies. And in the context of the British, fish in barrels provided a lot of the protein, a lot of the storable protein that could be moved to armies in different places. And that was huge. So that's one of the biggest drivers, is that of the Napoleonic Wars. And then you can see some of the other dimensions to it. The American Civil War is another one of those in terms of different pieces to it. Other ones that, of course, World War I, World War II. In each one of these cases, it's a matter of people need food, and this is a place to get food. There's also various crashes. So we think of boom and bust cycles in terms of sort of archaeology. We can see that these islands are not independent entities. They are connected to so many other places. They're connected to what's going on globally, think in terms of military conflicts. They're connected to what's taking place on a smaller scale within Ireland. And so they're responsive to this in different ways. Let me give you one other quick illustration of this to sort of show you some of the different pieces to it. So what you see here in the upper left, this is the Mackenzie map. This is from 1776. Remarkable. The island itself has been mapped 5 times. And that is incredibly helpful for us because it's allowed us to understand how this village has changed and to sort of think of the tempos of life. So 1776, Mackenzie goes and he maps it. And this is what you see. You see a scale of 2 blobs as hills, but then you see a cluster of buildings, 3 of them. Of course, it's not actually showing which buildings are where, it's showing that there's a village there. That's really all that's taking place. And that's the level of interest. This was a nautical map. So they did soundings, they did depth areas, but they weren't concerned about what was going on the land itself. They just needed to know this is the size of it, roughly. They never measured in any form. All of that changed. All of that changed with the Napoleonic Wars. And the reason why is that the British were terrified that the French were going to come through the back door of Ireland. And for good reason. The French had done that at different points. The Spanish had done that, whether you're talking about Cork, whether you're talking about in 1798 with French. So there are different points where all of a sudden 5,000 French soldiers would show up in Western Ireland, 5,000 Spanish near Cork. So the British government was enormously concerned that the back door would be invaded of Ireland. And so what do you have to do to basically address that as a risk? You need maps. And so what they did is they commissioned this series of surveys that were absolutely extraordinary. And this is the level of recording. These maps were done in such a way where now you have accurate shorelines. You have, for the first time, positioning of actual buildings. You also have names assigned to particular places in Irish that were used. So they're compiling all of this information and they're doing it in a brilliant way in terms of the quality of work. And they did all of Ireland. It is an absolutely remarkable feat of cartography to think about what they've done. So let me build on this a little bit to show you why Napoleon really helped us out. And that is that if you think of the 1816 map, the British came back and mapped it several other times. They came back in 1838. This is the village now, not the entire island. They came back in 1838 and they mapped it in detail. In 1848, another map was done. In 1898, another map was done. These are the same locations. And we now know we can identify set buildings and we can follow along. So we can see. So for example, you can see here, this is what we call building 6. This is the Halloran House. That's the building there. That's the building there. Obviously, some of it's gone between these two. In other cases, here you can see the church. And here's where the church is here. It says St. Leo's Chapel in ruins. It's not being used at that point. It was rebuilt after the first survey, the 1838 survey. So you can see by looking at these almost as layer after layer, you can start to see where were different houses at different points of time. That's a real advantage to us as archaeologists because it means now we can trace these things. So very, very helpful to have that. We can do things such as shoreline. We can understand the nature of coastal erosion. And it's a very scary story. It's not a good story in that particular case. So let me give you some examples of this. Because we've now done excavations of 8 different houses. And this has been critical because it's allowed us to help select which houses. Because now we can, in some cases, have a good sense of when these show up, which particular houses show up on which map. And since these maps are dated, this tells us a little bit about where these likely fit in time. So this is really helpful as a way of sort of going through with this. So here's the example I want to give you. I'm going to give you 3 spots that you can look at. And you're all adults and you can choose which one you want to look at. So the spots I want you to choose from are the school, house number 6 over here. And then one of my favorites is this one right here, which is Thomas Lacey's house. This is the port right here, by the way. You have what's known as the low road. This is the high road. It's not a road, it's a track, but it's called the low road, the high road. And then houses, houses, houses all the way across. A lot of houses in here don't show up, by the way. Okay, so what I want you to do is I want you to pick one of those places. And this is a LiDAR that's with this LiDAR, this mapping done from the air, the representation is basically down to a centimeter. It's incredibly accurate. So pick one of those spots, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to fade in the 1898 map. And I want you to see how closely the work from the basically our knowledge of the ground survey with a 1 centimeter resolution fits with the 1898 mapping. So here we go. So if you look at it as it fades in, what you're going to see is that those buildings show up where they should be. The part that's extraordinary about this is that this is before the days of wonderful mapping equipment. This was done when you think about 1838, 1898. This is all done with basically an optical device called a theodolite. It's basically you get a tripod, you put a survey instrument on top of it that is nothing more than 100 magnification lens in there. And then you have somebody who goes and stands off in the distance at a set distance with a stadia rod that's held up. And then what you do is somebody basically says, that's 200 meters this way at such and such a degree. And then somebody goes and starts developing the map. It's incredibly complicated. The other part to it that's extraordinary is that when you do that as a technique, you can only do things you can see. The part that's extraordinary about this is that you can't see all the way around. This is not the bald ass prairies of Nebraska. You can't physically see there. So it means you have to move your instruments. And the moment you move your instruments is the moment where you introduce computing errors. Not computing, because they didn't have compute. Recording errors are introduced. They had to move their instruments at least 3 times. And yet they are doing it in such a way where the accuracy is extraordinary. Say what you will about the Brits. Boy, they did amazing maps. They did extraordinary maps. Give them credit for it. Okay, so that's one of the things. Here's the Lacey House. And this is why this is so helpful to us. The people who did the work with us in terms of the processing, basically we commissioned a plane to fly over with twin prop plane to fly over, went back and forth. They claim that they can identify the direction of the wind based on the grass. I believe them. And here's why. So some of those things there are called sheep. And sheep are a certain size. They actually have a formula you can erase the sheep from. It's called the anti-sheep formula. And they can just magically do away with the sheep. But here's the other one. You see those? And those are fence posts that are this size. And you can faintly see it here. In some areas, strangely, it's picking up barbed wire. Sure, how do I do that? Because it's not showing up on my screen here. Okay, how do we... Oh, wait.
There you go.
Here, just hit admit.
Yep, you got it. Oh, sorry about that.
Nope. I'm not sure it's doing it.
I
think it's advancing the slides.
probably just hitting a little off.
Okay.
There we go. Can we get it? Stick it out there.
No, it's just advancing. Do you want to just jump out for a second? I just took us out of that. Try now. Okay. Anybody else, or is that
I think we're good.
okay? Cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think you just hit. Okay.
Well, let's go presentation again. And
Sorry.
we'll go back. No, not a problem. Not a problem. Okay. All right, so you can see here the resolution. So it provides us a great opportunity to start thinking about which houses are occupied by who and to be able to make a go of that in some capacity.
We're saying here's that's close and away.
Oh, yes. That line of stuff is called barbed wire. Yeah, because it's long enough that it's literally shooting something like 1,000 points per square meter. And so if you have strands that are coming through, it's actually starting to record that. So the resolution is brilliant for this. We can pick up wall features, all kinds of stuff. All right, so let's connect this to Bridget now. And what I'm going to do is I want to think in terms of where Bridget is and what's happening with her. So she's born in 1898. In 1907, she lives on Shark. She lives on this island. And I want to first start off by talking a little bit about who Bridget is and her family. So this is the census data from 1901. And with the census information, what they provide is an indication of the head of the household, the names of each person, and the age of each person. They also indicate if they can read or write English and or Irish. They also, in some cases, will put an employment category. So children age 10 are known as scholars. They don't go to school, they're scholars. So here's a photograph. This is Amelia, I should say. And this is her leaving the island. And this is the census information here for 1907. So I've rolled it from the 1901 to the 1907. So you have the grandmother, Mary Melia. You have George Melia, father, age 36. His wife, Anne Melia, she's a Lacey, and that's important in terms of her maiden name. She's age 32. And then they have a series of children. Mary, Anne, Bridget, Maggie, Agnes, Michael, and Celia, who you see here. Now, so we're sort of combining them together. If you notice, age 13, 11, 9, 7, 5, 2, etc. So what do you observe when you just look at that in terms of their names, their ages, etc.? What observations can you make that are important to understanding the family?
I can tell you one thing. So I think when I look at this, my great grandmother, who was Irish, was born 3 years before her. Although she was born in the United States, her parents were born in France. And she had that many siblings, and 4 of them died before the age of 5. So I look at that and say, wow, they have a big family, and a lot of the children survive.
Bingo. Survivorship here. They are essentially surviving. This is what you'd kind of expect for island reproduction. And that is that you have almost regular birth spacing, especially given that these are individuals on the island who are doing quite well. But then the other one is in terms of the population is doing pretty well. I think it's because they're outdoors a lot. There's lots of milk that's available, and there's relatively good food. So that's telling us something in terms of survivorship. The contrast for urban context, whether you're talking about Ireland or North America, is totally different. And we'll see that in another minute. So that's the first piece. Second piece to it, one male. The rest are all females. And it's a young family at this point, young girls, right? Okay, so those are the important pieces. Let's think in terms of what was life like in terms of Bridget living there. So Bridget lived in this house. This is the house she lives in. We know for all intents and purposes which room she was born in, because there's a central room, and then there's a room where the stock is, and then there's basically the parents' room. So we know which room she was born in. There's a later house that's part of the family that's erected. There's some other things, but this is sort of the landscape of life for Bridget. And that is, there's areas where they have field systems for crops. There is an area here It was used for playing in. We know the school, we have an understanding of the school, the church, all the different pieces. This is the school. This is the second school. This is what it looks like today, and that's a historical photo from 1960. The way school systems work, school at this point is essentially daycare. It's being used in such a way where boys stay in school sometimes age 12, 13, but basically by the point they can move around and can be doing tasks, they need to go fishing. They need to work in fields. Girls stay in school longer. They're the ones who learn how to read. They're the ones who develop more in the way of skills. And interestingly enough, in terms of immigration, they are the ones who, at least initially, are often sent overseas because they have reading and writing skills. They can serve as domestics in Boston or something similar. They have skill sets those boys don't, because the boys are manual labor. So there's an interesting incentive there at different points to think about. Okay, so yes, they all leave at an early point of their life. It's just a matter of when. The other part to it is we have extraordinary school records. We have school projects for some of them. We have school records in terms of attendance, and that's very helpful to us as we sort of go through this. Here's the other part to it. Here's the 1898 map, and this is the house. This is Bridget's house right here, where she was born, doing survey back years ago. We have ownership records because of just being preserved, which is just extraordinary. And this gives us a good sense of some of the objects and some of what's gone on in those places. Here's a little more detail. So we've sort of gone from the island to that of the village. Now we're sort of getting down much closer in scale. And to understand this, this is the LiDAR representation using this grayscale. And what you can see is an outline of different buildings. Because of this the different layers, we know which buildings were built after 1910. And these are the ones that are right here that you see. We also know which ones show up on the 1898 map. Those are the ones that are in the 1988 map. These are the ones that show up in the 1838 map. What you can see right here, which is sort of the frightening part about it, is that only 7 of the 27 buildings are visible today. They're basically buried buildings because the stones were removed, or basically they were kicked in and they've been grown over in some form. So we can do this now. We've gotten to a point where we've mapped about 110 buildings. We understand where they fit in this sequence. It's really handy that way. Okay, so that's Bridget's house right there, number 9. And we've done excavations of multiple houses around there and part of her house to try and explore that as well. So let me go through and show you some of the other little pieces here. This is the other thing we've done as we've sort of narrowed down our understanding, is that we've used various remote sensing techniques to understand what's below the surface. So that helps us in this particular case, where it shows us concentrations of walls and stones, outlines of buildings. It's been very handy to understand where these hot spots are, and they've helped guide us in terms of things. So in sum, if you look here, we know there's a whole series of buildings. They don't show up on the surface today as you walk across, but that guides us and has guided us in terms of where we end up doing excavations. So what do these results look like? Because I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time looking at artifacts and strat profiles and all the rest of it. Instead, I want to talk about Bridget and how we're pulling this together. But this is what these look like. And that is, you can see standing buildings in the background. These are very recent. This one was built in the 1930s. This one here goes back to 1898. 1838 shows up, maybe even earlier. And we have this combination, in this particular case, excavations in 2018 with one of the buildings from 1838. Believe it or not, that's a 4-room building that you see there with flagstones around the side of it. This is the southernmost part to it, that in this case is unexcavated. And this gives you what this building looks like. So that gives you a good idea of both the topography, but also the nature of what's hidden. This shows you a little bit more once you start thinking about it in terms of these layerings of buildings and the sort of history. So you can see here, just looking at the different buildings from different points of time. So this is really helpful because it helps us date these things. It helps us understand basically the village as a whole. And because of the fact that there's no parking lots today, there's no modern development, it means we can do that. Please.
Is adding stones something earlier houses to go later houses?
Yes, they are. And that's one of the interesting parts to it. In some cases, they're salvaging stone from it. In other cases, what you find is that the buildings are initially starting as houses, and then they're repurposed into things like barns, places where you'd have stock. One of the other things that's very, very handy about this is that by about 1910, before 1910, all of the buildings were designed in such a way where they go with the slope to minimize drainage. So what they do is that if it's the top of the hill, you have the water down here, all the buildings go at this angle, long axis here, because you don't want to trap water. So all of them work in such a way where they follow that. From 1910 onwards, they turn them sideways and they put them in this other position. They elevate them, there's better drainage, they use concrete, so the technology changes entirely. And that's kind of helpful for us as well, because it's another one of these ways where we can immediately recognize how old a house is. Okay, so here's one example, and to sort of connect it back to Bridget and to give you a sense of what we're wrestling with now. This shows you one of the scenes right here. So this is the Melia House, building 9 right in front of you. Here, you can see another area where there's building 8 beside it that we excavated a number of years ago. And we have an understanding of that these two were contemporaneous at one point. What we know is that eventually that building is torn down and these other buildings are constructed. What we also know is that with this construction, Bridget's family lives in here. Eventually, through marriage, they become Murrays, and they built this structure around 1910. That gets converted, Bridget's house gets converted into a barn. It was still standing, well, it's still standing there, but it's still being used actively in the 1950s as well. We've been able to interview people in terms of how it was used. One of the parts that's extraordinary is that when they emptied out that house, because of course you've collected garbage at some point, what they did is they went next door to this one, building 8, and they threw away a lot of the stuff. Interestingly enough, in field systems like this, you don't want to throw your garbage just into the field. And the reason why is that you don't want to have pieces of ceramic lying around where you have cattle or something else that might ingest it. So they're very compulsive about taking their garbage and putting it into abandoned buildings, such as building 8 here. So here's the excavation that we're undertaking of building 8 there. And the end product with that, and this kind of shows you those, is that they're taking large collections of material and just trashing it, putting it into it, so that we have large platters, we have large bowls, teacups, the list goes on and on, clay pipes, coins, glasses, all kinds of things. And that's very handy. We've been able to trace these back. I won't talk to you about this in any detail, but we've been able to trace these back. Most of these were produced in Glasgow in Scotland in different places, Edinburgh, Glasgow, and materials that were basically then shipped over, brought over in some form. So we've been able to trace, thinking of these collections of material, we've been able to trace them back to production centers into England and those different locations. So let's think about this in terms of Bridget and connecting it together. So what we now know is that there were three events that were absolutely critical to Bridget leaving. That she left in 1909 at age 11. She goes across to the States. And on the process of doing all this kind of research, we know that there are three events that were critical as a foundation for her. So let me just go through and sort of talk about those. First one was in 1907, May of 1907. It's very clear that there was a typhoid epidemic, and that came in, the typhus epidemic that came into Shark and Boffin, and it just went through wildfire. You can see here, this is the school record from Inishark at that point, where it says epidemic. Basically, they closed the schools on both islands. And it was one we know which children passed away because of the school records and because of the death records. And we know that that at least, 6+ children passed away out of 50 there. So it's a huge loss. And that must have been incredibly difficult. But we don't have a photograph of the kids at the school, but this is a 1905 photograph that Walsh took from a different school in Connemara. It gives you a good sense of what kids would have looked like on Shark. It gives you a sense, just crossing that line through, of how many would have disappeared from that class. So, very powerful event. The other powerful event is one that Anne Malia passes away. The mother passes away in 1908. She dies at age 31. She dies, from what we can understand through various oral history events, in a household accident. Most likely, for the accounts that various relatives have, is one of, there was a household accident that took place. And in the process, she passed away. She left her husband at age 37, who is the breadwinner of the family, having to go fishing. And he has 7 children, age 15 to 1. And as we just talked about, one of them is a boy and the rest are girls. And the boy is the second youngest. She probably died in the Malia house. She's buried somewhere there. That's the graveyard on Shark. None of the graves are marked in any form, so we don't know where she's buried at all. So, major problem. The next event, which is, I think, in some ways, the impetus for her leaving in the end, is that in 1909, early in the spring, in February, there's a series of individuals who leave Shark. This includes George Malia, Anne McGrail, who's a beeman, and 9 others. And they row in a single boat across from Boffin, from Shark to Boffin, across there. And apparently they were going across to petition for relief in terms of food, that they would be given some food because things were that bad. February is not a good month to go sailing across, rowing across. We don't know why, but what we do know is that the boat went onto the rocks in the harbor. And we know this because of a detailed newspaper account that was published and that helps us provide this understanding here. So it goes on the rocks in this particular place right here, as a matter of fact. It goes onto the rocks in front of everybody on Boffin who can see this. And yet there's nothing they can really do. George Malia is one of the individuals there that was absolutely extraordinary in this. 3 men drown in there, and Beeman and others cling to the rocks there. Eventually, some boats are able to come out and remove and get them out of there. All of them are near death because of the hypothermia that's involved in being in the water in February in some form. And George Malia basically rescues 3 people, one of which he takes an oar, sticks it underneath the arm, and then drags them to one of the rocks. So he saves 3 individuals, and it has to be absolutely devastating to him. His wife has passed away. It has to be absolutely devastating. And all of this comes together. And so from February 1909, George Malia is in a really awkward position. What are you going to do with his family? There are no other Malias on the island. His family is somewhere else on the mainland. His relatives are Lacey's through his wife. There's not an awful lot of them on that island either. So there's no little nursery that you can go to. There's no 16 brothers and sisters that can help you out in terms of labor. That's not a position. So this is what he does. So what happens is that they go into 3 different directions. What happens is that some of them stay on Shark. George Malia lives his life on Shark. He dies in 1937. He's buried on Boffin, the next island over. Michael Malia, who's the boy, right? He grows up on Shark. He dies on Boffin in 1950. But the strange part is, he doesn't leave school at age 12. He stays in school until age 18. Every year, he is advanced, year by year by year. He is the only male that largely stays beyond age 15, and most of them are gone by 12. And that in itself was very puzzling. And then when we started doing interviews, we understood that he was known as somebody who never went to water. He never went sailing. He never went fishing. We also know that as an individual, he physically was fairly short, somewhat squat, had a rounded face. My hunch is that he had Down syndrome or something similar, and that he essentially stayed in school because that was a place to keep him safe during those times. If he could have fished, if he could have done labor, he would have been doing that, but he didn't. So that's probably the scenario there, which makes it even more complicated. So George Malia, he keeps Celia Malia on the island. The youngest stays on the island. And she's raised on Shark, and eventually she connects to the rest of our story here. The mid-daughters that are here, or sorry, the oldest daughters, are kept on the island. He keeps Mary and Anne, and he keeps them on the island. And these are the daughters that probably were raising Celia and Michael. So 2 of the older ones, the 2 oldest ones you keep on the island to raise the 2 youngest ones, because George has to go fishing. He has to do these other little pieces there. So eventually they go to Munhall, Pennsylvania and Clinton, Massachusetts, but many, many years later. And then there's the 3. So what occurs in this case is Bridget goes to Boston, Massachusetts in June 1909. And on February 20th, and if you remember the timing of this, this is just after the event on Boffin where the individuals drowned. Agnes and Maggie are sent at age 9 and 7 to to Clifton, which is on the mainland. It's off island. So they can't be supported. They are sent somewhere else. In the particular case, Bridget is being sent for family in the States. So let's look at some of the different pieces here and the restructuring of the Malia family. So Maggie and Agnes are sent. Because of the school records, we know that February 20th is the last day they're in school. And basically, they're off the records. It said they're withdrawn from school or whatever the formal wording is. So they spend their last day in a Shark at the school with their friends and sisters. And then probably the first time they leave Shark, they're taken by their father to Cleggan, rowed across, and they're admitted into an orphanage at age 9 and 7. They're admitted into an orphanage. This is in Clifton. This is Clifton Bay right here to give you a sense of that. I've been able to go and find historical records that trace together some of this as well. This is the building in 1980 here. This is when I broke into the grounds in 2010 because I wanted to see what it looked like from the inside. It's now all upscale condos. It's been totally rehabbed, but I wanted to make sure I got a chance to see it. So I went there. These are the records for the boarding school. You can see right up here. It's run by the Sisters of Mercy Orphanage, the title of it. Here's the birth dates right here. Here are their names. They go there, they show up in February, they're 9 and 7. And the way these work is they were most likely separated from each other, 9 and 7. We also know this is the back end right in here. What we also know is we've been able to trace down various pieces through various research what's happened with some of them. So Margaret, she lived in Clifton from 1909 to 1916 or so. She then went to England and she disappeared. There's no trace of her at this point. We haven't been able to follow where she went into the UK. She basically disappeared. The other sister, Agnes, lived there in Clifton Orphanage until 1918. She moved back to Shark in 1918, and then she died of scarlet fever. And she, according to the relatives, was probably buried next to her mother. So horrible, horrible story in terms of sort of their world in some form of the kind of adversity that they must have faced. What about Bridget? And thinking about Bridget, what's going on with Bridget here? So with Bridget, she goes across, and we can pull apart various pieces of information. George Malia has to basically outsource the kids. He has to do this for their sake as well as his. It couldn't have been an easy decision, and we can't look back on that decision-making in a way that questions that. It must have been very, very difficult for him to make those kinds of choices. Either way, he makes arrangement for Bridget to depart and to go across to America, where there are some Lacey's, his wife's family. There are some connections there. That's what the port looked like before. This is what it looked like in 1960. I don't know. I think of the past in black and white at times. And somehow thinking of the last time she looked at this island, it somehow in my mind should be in black and white rather than color. So she goes across. She's taken to America by her cousin, John Lacey, who's being sent over there. John Lacey is 19. He's her cousin because of the connections with the Lacey family. So this is the boat. This is the SSI Verna in Boston Harbor in 1910. Google's a wonderful thing. The fact that we pull up images and find pictures of boats from 100 years ago. Extraordinary postcards, by the way. So at some point, she goes across to Clifton, probably cross down here to Galway, then down to Cove. She gets onto the SSI Verna with John, her cousin. They sail, departing on June 16th, because we have the ship manifest records. June 24th, she arrives in Boston. She arrives in Boston, and she's met, in her travels there, she's met by her relations. Come on, there we go. She's met by her relations after 8 days of at sea, because of the fact that we know the address in this lovely thing called Google Maps. We know that she had all of 5.6 miles to go. She was probably on streetcar with her uncle and various relations taking her across. She lived in Malden, Massachusetts up here, or she went to Malden, Massachusetts. She goes into this place called Boston. This is the 1880s. Into this place in Boston where she's grown up with X number of kids in a small stone cabin, 2-room stone cabin. And now she's going into a place with wooden Victorian houses with running water, gas, toilets. A very, very different world. Everything is totally different from the world she lived in. Here's the family that she joins. She comes into this family right here. So This is Bridget. The red dot is when these individuals came across from Ireland into the United States. She's joining her uncle Edward Lacey and Michael Lacey, and Michael is married to Ellen Lacey. What's the age difference between them? 8 years. She is 8 years older than he is. There's a story in that. I don't know what it is, but there's a story there. U.S. Census information provides us great detail about this. Here's the other particular part that's quirky. They have 6 children who are alive, 9 who have passed away. There's also, and this again is 1910 U.S. Census information, there are 4 children that are boarded with them with different last names. This has to be a creche. This has to be a, I'm not quite sure how to explain it. These are some of the other Lacey's. Here's John Lacey, her uncle who takes her, or her relative who takes her across, and various other Lacey's who have come across from Sharp. And these are the houses that they live in different places: Clinton, Lowell, Malden. And this is one of these things that we can start thinking in terms of sort of chain migration and sort of that flow of people coming in. These are the houses, just looking at the spaces today. Some of the buildings are still there, some of them are not. So Bridget comes in 8 days after leaving. She comes into this alien planet called Boston. She comes into this very, very different setting under which, where she grows up on an island of about 130 people at that point, maybe 15 families that are interconnected. And she's moving into the 5th largest city in the United States, huge population levels, incredible density of people. She's confronted by a very, very different world with ethnic diversity, with different languages, Russian, Italian, Boston English. I mean, it must have been remarkable, the difference in there. And being female and Irish was not a good thing at this point of time, both of those. She comes into this world that is challenging the morality that she's grown up with, the ethics. Here's one example right here. This is a major scandalous event in Boston in 1910. And this major newspapers for this. This is an individual by the name of Anne Kellerman, who was an Australian woman who was arrested for wearing shorts. Indecent exposure, that's right. By 1920, and I'm going to skip ahead here, Bridget never goes to school. I've gone and gotten school records from different places. Bridget does not go to school. She goes into the domestics. She's making money. She's folding laundry. She's doing other stuff. She shows up, though, again in 1920. She showed in 1910. Sorry, let me just deal with this one first. So here's the family she moves in with. The green ones are the ones that were born in Ireland, and are probably speaking with an Irish accent. All right. So here's Michael Lacey, 48, 50, 56, age 29. These are the Irish. These are the kids, all born in the United States. Sure, they're Irish parentage, but they're using different accents in different languages. These are the younger kids. You'll notice different last names, different ages, and Bridget is the only one at age 12 in that cohort of younger kids who speaks with an Irish accent. She's an instant outsider by definition. She may have been the most warm individual ever, but that's adversity. In terms of school systems, that's not an easy system to deal with. 1920, Bridget shows up. She shows up again. In this particular case, they've moved to a different place, but because of the census information, we know what she was doing. She was working at the Converse shoe factory in Malden, Massachusetts. She's working here Here's her age. She's a bootmaker. And she's working with most of her relations on the factory floors, making Converse rubber boots, shoes. She's working in a factory similar to this. She's living in a crowded house. She's walking to work, and it's 18 minutes walk. Using Google, we can sort of figure these kinds of things out. It's a factory of 3,000 people, and she grew up on an island of 160. Just think of scale. Just think of all the rest of it. And just as much, she sees this contrast of wealth probably every day that she walked, where she would see houses like this. And this is where the domestic Irish servants would go, and others would be there. So she sees this world of class that is very challenging. Here's the other piece to it. We now know, having traced sort of genealogies through some of the PhD research some of my students have been doing, we now know from Shark that the number of people coming across is very, very high, and they're going into very central locations. They're going into Boston, Malden, a few other particular places. And so we've been able to follow some of the movement of some of these families, and that takes us to Clinton, Massachusetts. And that is, this is some of the research that one of my PhD students has done. And that is, you remember Anne O'Malley, she's one of the other sisters. She's one of the oldest ones who comes across in 1923. She was the one who raised Celia and Michael. She comes across and she lives at this place right here. That's the world she entered into in Clinton, Massachusetts. These are all people from the island of Inishark. This is chain migration in all of the most diagnostic ways. And that is when people leave from one place, when people start to leave, they end up creating a network on a local level in America. They start sending back money. That allows for with remittances, allows for more people to go. And the families get reconstituted in a new place. And that's what's occurring, is that this village is being reconstituted in the small village of Clinton, Massachusetts, which is a mill town that does carpets and other things. So these are all the different names of different people. Harrigan, Clunan, Maggie Moore, these are all the names. And when you go to the graveyard, the Catholic graveyard, it's extraordinary because you're walking through island populations who have relocated across. It's quite extraordinary. Annie O'Malley, so Bridget's sister, older sister, she gets married. Here's her wedding certificate from 1925. And she gets married to Michael Halloran. They're cousins. They're both Lacey's. He's age 28. This is the address where he lives. That's where they move into. This is the wedding certificate for the individuals that are there. And Annie, interestingly enough, she lies about her age. She's chopping off 2 years from this. She's actually 3 years. She's actually 29 years. I think it's because Michael is 28. She's older than he is. And that's not socially acceptable at this point. We know that they're relations. We know they both had met on Shark. So it's fascinating, sort of this sort of small communities that are reframed. I don't know for a fact, but I bet big money that Bridget Malia is there at the wedding. I don't know that for a fact, but I bet you big money that she is. The reconstructed villages. This shows you right here. This is an 1878 view of Clinton, Massachusetts. These are the houses just in this one area, showing the number of islanders and where they're relocated. This is where Anne goes to with her new husband right here. This is a fascinating building. The islanders had their own bar downstairs in the basement. So they had their own social communities as well. So her reframed world, in terms of Bridget's world, which I've now pursued in terms of all kinds of historical records in the States and looked in Massachusetts to sort of go through these and sort of go through the different pieces. She goes from the 1890s of rural island context to one of sort of Worcester, Massachusetts, the kind of place you'd expect in some form. And from this point, I've run out of records. I don't know what happened to Bridget. I've spent a lot of time and had people look for me for money to try and understand. There are no more records that we can find in terms of Massachusetts at this point. And I don't really know. So what happened to her? Well, I'm going to be a romantic. I am a romantic. And I'm going to play this in the context of, I really hope that she married a great Irish man from the islands. They loved each other deeply. They had just enough kids to make everybody happy. They negotiated that in some form. I don't know. I don't know. This is a difficult time. This had to be a very complicated world for her, given the sort of the dislocation, the construction of new families, all the rest of it. I don't know where that takes us in terms of this. If I had to bet money, it's that she's outside of Pittsburgh, that she moves with her other sister who goes to Munhill, Pennsylvania. And if I had money, that's where I'd go spend it to try and find her, because I think that's probably where she ended up. It just makes sense. She'd end up with her sisters and hopefully that great husband and, the kids and their new world in some form. So for me, this is sort of this, in some ways, a very unconventional archaeological talk, thinking in terms of how to blend some of these things together, to think in terms of an individual, and in doing it in such a way where it can shed light on the whole process and shed light in terms of immigration and the different pieces and sort of create a face. So what do we take away from this? Well, I think we can take away a number of different pieces. One part to this is this story that's relevant today in terms of dislocation, the challenges that immigrant populations face in moving back and forth. Something that is a very human story about the kind of ways in which humans deal with adversity and can overcome it in some remarkable ways. It's also one of thinking about the sort of soft underbelly of people that don't always appear in our national records, in our big records. This is thinking in terms of people who growing up in fishing communities, then coming and working as domestic servants, working in factories, those kinds of things. So it's an unfinished story in some ways. I don't mind that. Increasingly, when I first started doing this and sort of ran into these brick walls, I found it really difficult and kept looking for more and more records and still couldn't find them. And now I've kind of reconciled myself to it, because in some ways, I don't want to know. I want it just to be like this, because it gives me a sense of where she stands. Now, before going on, I do want to provide acknowledgements to various individuals, many different islanders, most of which have passed now, unfortunately. But in the process of me taking them back with film crews and interviewing them and visiting with them, they've been very, very generous over the years in helping understand how some of this fits together, and very patient, given the kind of questions that archaeologists can ask them that are not necessarily awkward, but kind of unusual for people. So I appreciate your indulgence. I've gone a little long, and I appreciate your time and patience. Thank you very much.
At this point, we have 11 more on Zoom and probably more on Facebook. So good. More than this year. Also, my grandmother and grandparents traveled on the Archaeology.
No.
Yes.
If there's any questions, I'm quite happy, but you needn't feel obliged to by any means. If you do have a question.
I'd like to comment, my grandparents lived around the same time period, and I've researched them. My grandmother lied about her age for her whole life. She was 3 years older than my grandfather, but would never admit that. So yeah, that was definitely, there was stigma there. I don't know if you did this, but it was easier with my grandparents because we lived in small towns, is that I went through newspapers.com and I was able to read quite a bit about their life for, many, many decades. Did you look newspapers?
We did not spend a lot of time with the newspapers in Clinton, Massachusetts.
Okay.
That's another possible source, yeah.
Yeah, bigger cities like Boston, I mean, that would be very difficult. But luckily for them, I found things. Another thing too, that I found very strange and very foreign with our modern sensibilities is that when writing about a person, writing about a woman in the newspaper, she would not only have her husband's last name, but her husband's first name. So they would say Mrs. Raymond Lowry.
Yeah.
So she loses her first name. She's the wife of this person and she has no other name. So that's, I think there might be some older folks today that still are addressed like that.
Yes.
So anyways, questions?
What is her family? Okay, what is her family that have you spoken with them and what do they think happened to her?
Yeah, I sat down with, so Celia Murray, the youngest daughter. Celia Murray, the youngest daughter, who stayed on Sharp. Her children, Martin here, for example, Leo, others. These are, let's get this right. They were their children. And so they were very interested. I sat down with them and talked to them individually and said, this is what I know. Because these are, it's a very odd thing. I now know more about some of their family history than they do. Not in terms of their direct experiences, but in terms of sort of archival understanding of relations and going back multiple generations. And so at one point one of them asked me and said, what happened with these? And I said, look, I'm gonna be honest and I'll tell you what I know. It's not an easy story. And I told them about their two aunts going into the orphanage, which there's still considerable shame associated with that. And I related that and they said, wow, they were quite stunned by it. So it's a very odd thing to be in a position to provide insight in terms of the archaeological material world that the living relatives don't have of their parents and grandparents, but also that in some cases of oral history and in some cases in terms of historical records about that. So they're very interested in it. There's a degree of trepidation because they knew that all stories are good stories when you start thinking in terms of Ireland and pre-1920, shall we say. So there's a lot of complexity to it, and it's a very it's complicated relationships and sort of complicated profession. They sort of try and find a way to sort of weave through some of those roadmaps of challenges in a way that one can still say you're dealing with it with integrity and professionalism and also a degree of privacy as you're talking about it at certain points. It's very complicated. Please.
You mentioned that the girls mostly have learned to read and write, but there are no oral history or with remembrance of people from the States writing back to Ireland?
Well, this is one of the interesting parts to that, is that what you find with the Irish, and I don't know to what extent this would roll on to Italian or other groups in some form, is that what you would find is that with the first generation, so people leaving Ireland going across, they would send back letters. They would send back packages of clothing. They would send back remittances in terms of money. In some cases, they would send back basically ship tickets, tickets for a voyage to come across. And these were understood and sort of negotiated. People rarely came back. They did occasionally, but that's really only from post 1920 that started to happen. Usually it was a matter of once you were gone, you were gone. So there would be the occasional letters, and there would be things like that. The phrase that's often used is that after some period of time, the letters stopped coming. And it's not clear in those situations to what extent it's a matter that somebody has created a new life, and the old life is now less important, or whether it's a matter that the people who are writing those letters have now passed on. But for all intents and purposes, those bonds and those connections were not being materialized anymore in terms of those kinds of connections. Hence the importance of where I started off the talk in terms of voice. You know, we think nothing to pick up a phone and call a relation, and here's your 5-minute quick conversation about the weather and whatever else. But to think about being in an environment where, with the archaeology of Ireland from the 1900, and that somebody would step away and you would never hear the voice of your child again. That's powerful.
That was actually one of the things that had an impact. Telephone now, but I emigrated to New Zealand for a few years in the late 1980s, and you weren't picking up the phone, and very rarely when I did it, my grandfather, you know, we were moving them farther away from home, closer. And so there really was, I didn't have anything like that kind of isolation, but that really struck home. So thank you for
Sure.
speaking of it in those terms.
Sure, of course. Of course. Yeah, please.
How about like the Converse factory? Like, are there records of, like, there's Potter Cemetery for people in the area? I love your optimistic story.
Sort of, I saw.
I was like, what if, like, you know, it's pre-labor law, she dies in factories. Is it possible she was just buried?
Well, this is
Like, I don't know what the death rate is.
right. There's no death record for it. But keep in mind, if she gets married, the last name changes. So maybe that's a good story. But there's no record that I've been able to find, or an archivist that I hired at one point to basically find a record for her in terms of death records. I hadn't thought about the Congress. I don't know if there's employment records and those kinds of things. That'd be fascinating.
You know, I can't help look at this and compare to my great grandmother who was this age, but I guess I think that's, but she went to work at watch factory when she was 12, Philadelphia, but she was married by 15. I give birth, and I knew her. She died when I was 30s. But I think she got married early with that kid. So maybe it's the marriage record to be looking for, because she would have changed her name.
Right.
Yeah, I definitely think she found out. So, any idea how old Bridget was when she worked in the factory?
How old she was? She was 21 in the 1920 census. She's listed, the 1920 residential census, she's listed as being age 21. Now, we have to take some of that with a grain of salt because, you know, it could be one of those, first of all, when a person comes to the door for census information, she may not be there. She may talk to the mother and say, what's the name of the kids? And she'll look, this one's 19, this one's 14, this one's, I don't remember, 13 and a half. Or, so, yeah, but she's 20, 21 in that zone.
Like you say, talk to some of their relatives. DNA, have you done any research on the DNA to try to find some of the relatives? Because I went through a journey of learning about my own family and submitted DNA, and I've come into contact with many like distant cousins and found photos of family members from the 1800s, and it's just a fantastic journey.
Yes, I mean, the historical, I'm not sure I'd feel comfortable with some of that in terms of, DNA, in terms of hair samples and living populations and all those other pieces. I don't know, I haven't thought that one through, and I know there's something that's it's a very interesting story. It's one that I think is very revealing. You know, I can just as easily think in terms of my relations, and I'm sure you can think of some of your relations. Doesn't matter again whether you're talking about Italians, with Irish, something else. Those kinds of challenges and the kind of adversity of our ancestors who came across, built this particular country. We couldn't make up those stories because they're just extraordinary. And despite the extraordinary nature of that in some form, there's an intrusive dimension to this that at times I find really uncomfortable, and it makes me uncomfortable. It's something that I think their relations are comfortable with me sort of talking about it in some capacity and sharing some of this in different capacities. But it's
certainly in that journey, you're gonna find things that you don't expect, and some things that are just frankly embarrassing. So,
yes.
You know, I had a question you alluded in the beginning to the world history, but we didn't talk about too much, but it's on the website. Are there films in world history related to this project?
There's one, yes and no. There is, we have film projects that we've done in terms of the islands themselves, in terms of the archaeology, but that's just the archaeology connected to it. The other one we have done is a film called Nets of Memory, and it's a 60-minute documentary that it's filmed in 5 locations in the United States and 6 in Ireland. And it's one of looking at traditional net making, fish net making, and that of boat making, and basically place of the sea and landscape in place. What became very clear out of this is that to understand, I think that to understand the dislocation that's taking place when we think of historic archaeology and the dislocation of people coming across to the United States, you're both simultaneously trying to hold on, that first generation is trying to simultaneously hold on to their sense of place and memory that they grew up with in Europe in some place. I'll just use Europe as an example. And at the same time, create a new world and a new place. And in a way that's essentially for the next generation. It's an altruistic act of remarkable consequence by giving that up in some form. So when I started doing this work, I realized Bridget has relocated to this place. She's living in Boston, 6-story buildings. She's working the Converse rubber plant with 3,000 other people. The contrast is that she grew up on Shark, looking out at the ocean every morning. People fishing, all the rest of it. And so I started doing work trying to think about some of the pieces to that. And that led me through one interview when I gave a presentation similar to this in Clinton, Massachusetts at the Historical Society. And I had an individual who came up to me, John J. Howard, who's related to Michael Howard, because they're all interconnected. And he came up and he said, I'm related to Michael Howard. I said, I'd like to buy you a coffee. So we went to a Dunkin' Donuts the next day. And he told me a story. He told me a story about his grandfather, Festus Howard, who could not want a relative named Festus. It's a great name. Festus Howard comes across in 1878. He's born in 1878. Comes across in 1898, just the same time he comes across Shark. And he starts working in Clinton in those same kinds of factories, except for they're in Clinton, Massachusetts, with lots of documentation with his family's there, his family. So what John J. Howard told me in that little moment as we were having coffee is he told me about Festus Howard, who passed away in 1944. So for 42 years, 1942, for 42 years, Festus, while working in these factories, also every time he wasn't planting crops or hanging out with the family, he would go to his garage and he would make fishing nets. He would sew traditional fishing nets. And these things are large. These are easily double the length of this room. These are massive things that you crochet together. It's big hours and hours. And he would make these nets. And then over months and months. And then he would go and he would hang them on the side of his garage on a series of posts. And he would hang them there. He never taught anybody how to make the nets. He never went fishing again. He never used any of those nets again, despite Clinton being all of 60 miles away from Boston with at least 9 trains going back and forth every day. He never went back and saw the ocean again. So for 44 years, he continued to make nets for no economic purpose. It was, from my standpoint, it was his therapy. It was his way of meditation, basically trying to find a happy space for his memories of the past as he was living in this new world. And when John told me that story, I said, we got to do a film. We got to make a film about that. And that's where it connected to the Murrays, and in terms of Amelia, Bridget Amelia, because it's about place. The whole aspect, when you think of the impact of going to a place like Clinton or Boston or Chicago, or wherever you want to think about it, it is all about place. That is, I would assume, one of the most difficult parts about it. As they're moving their family across, they've got their families here, they've got some relationships. Sure, those bonds aren't as connected, and yeah, there's dislocation. But I think a big part about it is you're giving up the place you grew up for living in an urban environment. That was a very long answer to your question. But if you're so interested, I can send you, it's up on YouTube and Vimeo. Sure, it's called Nets of Memory. Nets of Memory. Welcome.
If you can send me those links, I can post them.
Oh, that's a great idea. I totally will.
I have a question from Zoom. Stephen Ross asks, why was the island abandoned?
Right. So, yeah, so there was at least, let's call 300 people there in the 1820s or so. 1960, there's only 25 people there. And so there's different reasons why it was abandoned. One is clearly a function of scale. There was no longer enough people, as they put it, there was no longer enough people to grab the boats for when somebody comes in. There's not a good harbor there. And so you need a situation where if a boat comes in, a small boat with barrels of flour or other things, you need people to grab the boat. You need people to grab the goods to take it off as quickly as possible. And they didn't have that. There weren't enough people to basically offload quickly given the high risk in situations. There wasn't enough people in terms of farming. So scale is one of the big ones there. There's 2 other answers to it that I think layer into it for why people finally left. First one is very remote, and you can't access it. There was never a priest there that lived there year round. So it was a situation where in 1953, if I recall correctly, where an individual had an appendicitis attack, and they were not able to get the person off, and the individual passed away. And it was a situation under which they were not able to provide access to so many of the kind of services they knew were going on the mainland. There was an active church on the mainland. There was medical services on the mainland. There's getting to a point where there was this thing called theater and movies and all these other things they knew about. But most importantly, not just elements of comfort, but there were elements of human safety, that you couldn't get medical treatment out there, even for something as major as that. And I think that was another dimension to it, is that. The third one is just comes down, from my standpoint, just comes down to the sense of insecurity. And that is that Teresa Lacey, good friend who's passed now. And when I interviewed Teresa at one point, she related how when her mother would stay awake at night when her husband and her sons, so Teresa's brother and father, when they would be out fishing at night, because her mother was constantly listening for the sound of the wind. And if the wind changed and it changed directions, and then she would know that her husband, her sons were at risk because they were fishing at night, somewhere off in the water with no compasses, no kind of direction finding, all the rest of it, you know, sort of the common things that we think about. And she said that her mother was constantly worried about that. And I think that's another part to it, is it's just the things, the luxuries that we take for granted were just in terms of our safety and just in terms of how we deal with stress, that was part of their world. And I think between scale and all of those, it just became far too much. That's not a good way to finish the talk on, but.
Just that one, thank you for this, because so often, even for doing historical archaeology, we don't know individuals. We're talking in general, the X culture, the Y culture, or, you know, creating artifacts of, and have something brought down to this intensely individual. It's a good reminder that when we don't know, can't know the individuals, that they were in fact individuals. So thank you for that. That was very poignant.
You're welcome. I agree. That is an important dimension in terms of sort of archaeology as a practice, because yeah, we're dealing with a compilation of material objects. It's a homogenization, but they're also created by individuals, and there's all those other pieces. And I think the other part to it is not only the recognition of the individuality and the agency there, but the other part to it is that it's easy to whitewash the past in terms of the challenges that people faced, and the fact that our ancestors as a collective global entity, let alone sort of family ones, overcome so many of these challenges. I find absolutely extraordinary. So yeah.
Another example of being able to build on people's lives and historical record is that in 1908 there was a race riot in Springfield, Illinois, and and quite a few houses were burned. And then recently, in terms of a highway project, it was going through a part of that area where there were burned houses, and it had been preserved because there was a parking lot over it. And so that they found that there were cellars and really quite a bit of good excavation there. And then using what they were able to excavate from the houses and the historical records and newspaper accounts and the census records and all that, they were able to put together the same type of story for a little bit different situation. And they were able to reconstruct how the reports of the time were dramatically colored by ideology of individuals, as opposed to what the real circumstances were of the people, because they'd sort of written off this part of town as being lower class black. And there was some of that over there, but this particular set of houses was essentially middle class black, rewriting, adjusting the historical record. So I'm pretty good friends with the person who did that excavation, and at the state fair, we've been able to highlight his work each year. And on August during state fair, President Biden signed a document, legislation that it's now a national monument for the race riot site. It's pretty cool.
Wow, that's brilliant. Yes, and as you pointed out, that's one of the elements of what archaeology can do, is it can provide that richer and complementary and contrasted at the same time aspect to the historical records, to the documentation. Yeah, very powerful when we're able to sort of weave those things together in some form.
And from my being an addict of finding our roots, they find amazing things in newspapers. Now they've got quite a team of genealogists who do all that research for them. It's just amazing the number of times they find newspaper things on fairly ordinary individuals. So there might be something out there.
You're saying there's hope.
Well, my research on newspapers.com, when I found out about my family, I mean, newspapers were like the Facebook of their time. I mean, it was a social media of their time. I mean, they would post up about surprise parties and who went on vacation, all this kinds of stuff, practical jokes. I mean, especially the small town newspapers, they write about anything.
I have a question about your records. So I've done just preliminary research into my Irish family and if I can put it down again. I hear a lot of Irish records were destroyed by fire or something that were in centralized places. Are the records you're using, did you find a lot of them locally? Did they keep records on the island?
It depends which kind of records. So what you find is, and I can speak to Ireland, I can't speak the kind of US documentary records other than the census information and the more crude muscle material that I've used here. But in terms of Ireland, what you find is that baptismal records and marriage records and often the death records are usually held on a local level. And in some cases, school records held on a local level. The census information is the big loss when there was the 1922. That was, major records that were lost at that point. Some were duplicated in some places, and there's attempts to sort of string that together. So it really depends what kinds of records. It really does. But then between things such as census information, there's the national census, the 1901, 1911, and then there is extraordinary records for the SSI Verna or other vessels that basically can provide that sense of the movement of people across the Atlantic. So there are ways to get to it, but I think as you can see from this kind of presentation, that's the nuts and bolts, and to get to sort of that deeper family history, it really is the necessity of things like marriage records and all the rest of it, and really trying to understand how some of these different pieces do fit together or might have been something that people wanted to avoid, age and why you would change your age in some form. Yeah. Welcome.
I'd like to present you with a certificate here for coming out today.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. Well, thank you once again.
A fantastic presentation, and I hope you can join us in the future, either in person or virtually. Especially want to hear about all the work you're doing in Ukraine. That sounds fascinating.
You can do that.
October 27th, we will have Dr. Ann Purburn, I believe her probably Pryburn. Okay, from the University of Indiana, Bloomington, discuss a theory of the Mayan collapse. It didn't happen. All right, so hope you all come out next month, October 27th, either in person at the Evanston Public Library at 3 o'clock or on Zoom at 3:30. Hope to see you next month, and please renew your memberships. We have the Chicago Archaeological Society.com. You can go there and renew your membership online. You could use a credit card if you like, or the information is also there if you want to mail in a check, and it gives you membership into the Illinois Association for the Advancement of Archaeology. Also